Hey, Dave Beasing with Sound That Brands. Very pleased to be joined today by two smart people. We have Tim Bronsil, CEO of Point to Point Marketing, and Hal Rood, partner at Strategic Solutions Research. These guys are so smart that they not only conducted, authored a breakthrough study called the Podcast Study, but so smart that they were the first to think of registering the URL, thepodcaststudy.com. Good
That was a
job,
good
you
day,
guys.
Dave. That was a
That
good day. We discovered the .com was free. I'll
was
take
that the
that.
first one you tried, or were there others?
It was on the list that we brainstormed, right, Tim?
Yeah, it was one of the top ones. We said there's no way that this is available. And then double checking the spelling multiple times. Yeah, make sure.
Right?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
great.
Not even the podcaststudy.net. You got .com. Good job.
Yeah.
So there it's all there for those that will go to the podcaststudy.com, the charts, the graphs, the webinar recordings, and I hope everybody will because there's so much good information there. I wanted to today selfishly ask a few questions that pertain directly to my business and my clients, but then again, my issues are not different from most. Podcast discovery has been a big issue in our industry since it's been an industry. Uh, Tim, we'll start by asking a very basic question, but you got some great data, I'm sure. If you're launching a new podcast and you have zero marketing budget, should you even try? I mean, if you build it, will they come? Or what do you recommend?
Let's go back to that study and reference what we found in there is there were three clear winners for discovery in what the listeners told us, and that was social media, friends and family, and then suggestions from the platform as to where you get your podcast from. So there's some clear things that you can do in there without any budget at all. So let's tackle the zero budget first of all. Social media, getting into the rhythm of creating and posting on an ongoing basis about your relative advantages is a good process to go through. And I realize it's extra work, but those 30 to 60-second clips, showcasing that really give a listener an opportunity to know what that show is going to be about. So we would recommend make sure that you're doing that. The second part is friends and family. And this is going to reference back to that first part, is that this is really word of mouth. And in the podcast study, what we ask them is when you are telling someone about a podcast or hearing about it from someone else, is that the person telling you, hey, Dave, there's this great podcast about business. It deals with a number of issues within the workplace, dilemmas, et cetera. You should check it out. Or do I send you a clip? And what we found in there is that it was about half and half. So this goes back to the first part. Let's make sure that we're creating those opportunities for people to share those bite-sized snackable pieces, whether that's in an email or on social media, etc. Um, don't sleep on email, which I just referenced, is that it's a great way to connect with the audience. And 84% of the audience said that they would open an email if it came from the host. And I'm sure that Hal's going to talk about this later. The power of the host is something that we really saw in this study and how important that was. And these are things that you can really do for free or for little amount of money.
Yeah.
The last thing is to really nail that your podcast search optimization. And what I mean by that is how you're describing the particular episode. Are you using keywords that are important both within your genre, but also are very searchable? And then how are you using that in each episode description to maximize the tags that you have in there? And so all those things you can do on zero to little budget.
Hmm.
So nail the social media, nail the friends and family, nail email, and then at that point, make sure that your search is up to speed.
And this may be beyond the scope of the study, and but how do you get those great search terms? What do you recommend for figuring out what those keywords are?
Sure, absolutely. Last thing I'm going to do is plug what we do, but there are companies out there that will help you do this and search both within Apple and Spotify to say, these are the keywords that we see in our episodes. For example, working with a business podcast, as I referenced before, imposter syndrome, workplace dilemma, workplace conflict, etc., making sure that those are in every single description. Even if that particular episode is not about that particular subject, make sure that you're including in your later description, deep in that
Yeah.
in that episode. If you like this and you also want to hear about XYZ, make sure that you're tuning in on a regular basis. Make sure that your hashtags are matching that. And podcast search optimization companies will show you how hard it is to cut through in that particular keyword, but
Yeah.
also then what the upside of that is. And so teaching your team how they can write these descriptions, both from the episode standpoint, but also just overall how your podcast is working. We had lastly another podcast that was deep into music history and actually went through the process of changing their name from just the name of the show it was before to the name of show music history. And that has changed a lot of their search optimization as well.
Wow. Wow. So let's say you do have a little bit of a budget, and you're launching with, I don't know, 20 or $30,000. That would be a lot for a lot of shows. Uh, where would you put that money?
Yeah, the basics don't change of those pillars that I mentioned before, but now it's understanding the different platforms and how they can serve the need for you to get that download, to get that listen, to get that follow. And I think we all have our preferences to what social media networks we like to use on a regular basis. Really pay attention to the metrics underneath that that is getting you that click, that's getting that additional. Instagram is probably one of the most beautiful places to showcase your content, but look at your clicks there compared to some other networks that are out there. It, one of the really heartening things that we saw is that 66% of the sample said that they saw a post from a podcast, I believe it was in the past week or so, and 82% said that they found it interesting. So it is just, if you have a little bit of budget, make sure that you're going into the networks that people are going to see it and spend time to take that next step to learn more about it. Now, that isn't to say don't use those other networks that don't have high click through rates. Like all of us, we use multiple platforms, and there are reasons to stay in front of people from a branding standpoint. Um, and then what I would say is when you have that 20 or $30,000, is be careful of gimmicks. Is that if it sounds too good to be true, that they can get you this for that, and it's unlike anything that you've seen out there or that your colleagues have experienced, be careful of those things. Marketing is a long process. Hal and I have spent decades working with brands, and we know that it can take months, years to build up a show, to build up a brand, etc. And don't get frustrated if out of the first $20,000 you spend, you don't get to the subscriber level that you wanted. But if you're getting some traction there, there's an opportunity to build upon those successes and go back to people on an ongoing basis.
So the other topic that I wanted to discover or to discuss with you today is about building a community, and that probably relates pretty well to taking that next step of uh, a show that's already established but needs to break through a plateau in its loyalty and its reach and its loyalty. How with the brands that you've worked with for podcasting and what you've seen from the study, uh, a lot of my clients are used to are thinking of their podcast as part of a long-term brand building strategy, community building strategy. What do you see the podcast role in doing that?
I love the word community that you used. It's an interesting word choice, and I'm sure you didn't use it by accident, right?
It's in the
Um,
notes here. Yeah.
it's, it's fine.
Yeah.
But I like the word choice because it connotates a relationship with people, ideas, experiences, and so I just feel like community doesn't really form around a brand necessarily. It forms through the brand. And I think the podcasting is a fantastic way for a brand to enrich its relationship with consumers. And so, okay, how do we form this community around our brand or through our brand? Well, you form it through repeated choice, emotional attachment, and participation. And so it's not easy necessarily to build that community through repeated choice. You have to earn it. The podcast space is very competitive. 59%. The majority of listeners regularly consume just three or fewer podcasts. So the shelf space is limited in that way. But if you can form a program that really touches people and is useful for people and makes them feel something, and you can get into that top three, you're going to get usage. And if you can become their favorite,
Right.
then you're really cooking because, 3 out of 4 people say they love their favorite podcast. Love.
Mhm.
They didn't have to say love in our survey, but they said
They
love, and
did.
that's about emotion. So, how do you get that emotional connection with a community? It's through hosts. 80% of the people, 8 out of 10, say the host is a major reason why they
Huge.
listen to their favorite podcast. So, select that host really carefully, and because, if that host, just further data to kind of back up the importance of the host, the majority of people would consider at least stopping listening to that podcast if the host left. So choose carefully, and that host says something about your brand. So obviously choose it really carefully, because the host acts as the trusted center of the podcast, and
Right.
you have that consistent voice, creates familiarity, safety, and you get that regular usage, which is so key to podcasting.
The host choice is an interesting topic that often comes up in producing for brands because the inclination of a brand is often, having been in marketing for years and casting 30-second commercials and whatnot, considering getting a celebrity. And that may not be worth the money. It causes sampling, but there are plenty of Meghan Markles out there who uh, get the sampling but don't convert to loyalty once that show is up and running. And so, how do you find a host that just through a couple of auditions, perhaps, really seems like they bring that loyalty and community factor?
Yes, yeah, and I think you said it in the question. If you choose a high profile host, if you have the budget for that then you're tapping into their community, their fan base. Does it match the fan base that you really want for your brand? That's, I think, a key question. If you don't have that budget, a lot of brands don't want to dedicate that kind of budget just to a host. We've seen brands that have television spokespeople in commercials where you can build a character, build a character or a host from someone who's not really known. And in that case, and there's a lot of value to that too, because then you're building content around that host and around your brand values. And so, I think and we can talk a lot about, all right, how does that content look and how do you get regular usage through content? But even beyond that, once you have a community going, you can form a deeper connection with listener participation. That's how someone really feels like they're part of a podcast community as well. And we're talking about events,
Sure.
merchandise. Events are a great way once you build that community. 25%, only 25% of the people we surveyed have attended a podcast hosted event. But those that attended, 7 out of 10 say made them feel fantastic about the
Good.
podcast afterwards. Like if you can get
Good.
that kind of glow for
Mhm.
your brand through the podcast,
Right.
then you're really cooking.
Well, and those are certainly monetization opportunities as well, those community events. And frankly, speaking of budget, coming up with that budget can often depend on the ability to monetize. So it all kind of feeds into itself there. Fascinating stuff. Anything else that you guys want to add, or should we close this out? I want to make sure I mention again that they need to go to the podcaststudy.com and what to find there. But what else would you bring up on these topics?
I'd like to piggyback on all the great stuff that Hal just said and underline some of the points about the host is that community, the listeners, if they believe that they have a direct connection to the show, to the host, that emails are answered, that social media comments are replied to, that does quite a bit because they feel as if they are truly connected. And for some of my clients, there may be some blind spots on certain social media networks, and make sure that you correct those. If you're used to just playing on these two or three, make sure you're checking the others and getting back to people on an ongoing basis. That just builds that loyalty that is very simple to do and doesn't have to be the host that does it, but there should be somebody on staff that is tasked with all of that.
That's a great call. Great call.
Yeah.
And when you talk about building a podcast, there's a big misnomer in among podcast creators that, hey, this is a relaxed format where we can just kind of open up the mics, start the podcast, and just kind of meander. Consumers today really don't want that, even in the podcast space.
Right.
75% of the people that we surveyed in the podcast study want very little chit chat in the beginning. Some want you to dive right into the topic, but 75% at least want very minimal chit chat, get into the content that you promised. And I think that is really significant for brands to consider when they're putting together a podcast, especially if you've spent money on marketing and people are trying you for the first time. You want a fast start, get into the content. People don't have a lot of time to sit around and hope you get to something useful or interesting. And the fact is 4 out of 10 told us they would not give a podcast a second listen, a second chance if they're disappointed when they check out a podcast for the first time. 4 out of 10. So, you're really in danger of a real leaky bucket unless you really just dive in and give the listener a content payoff right from the beginning.
That's one area where traditional radio TV content has learned that all along because they have to keep people in the seats, so to speak, to use the theater metaphor, constantly. And though there are differences between the media, between podcast and broadcast, certainly, that's one place where, in some ways, radio people understand that better, I think.
Yes, and I think podcasting is getting there. Like, I think more and more creators are understanding there's a real reward to that. I mean, heck, all you have to do is watch Stranger Things, and they don't get to the opening credits until 8 minutes in, right? Start with a hook, and that's the concept we want podcasters to work under. Start with a nice quick hook, get into the content, and you're off to the races.
I hope everybody will go to the podcaststudy.com, check out the charts and graphs, watch a couple of the webinars. And because both of you gentlemen and me too, we have background in legacy media, I hope that our friends who see this from that world will check out a webinar that you did specifically about the brave new digital content world and applying that to legacy media because it's we've seen the charts that say, and maybe you guys have produced them, that say that on demand has surpassed linear content, and you got to figure out which line you're going to ride from here on out. The linear folks need to figure out how to do more on demand. There's no doubt about it.
Absolutely.
Yes.
This was great, Dave. Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
Dave.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.